Date, December 19, 1944. Location, Bastogne Sector, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Time, 5:30 hours. Weather, -10 degrees Celsius, light snow, overcast. The darkness over the Ardennes was absolute, broken only by the faint glimmer of falling snow caught in the weak glow of a half-frozen lantern swinging outside an American command post dug into the edge of the forest. Inside, tension hung like frost on the steel helmet stacked by the door. The Battle of the Bulge was raging, and across the front, the unthinkable had happened. The Germans had broken through. They had thrown their best armored divisions, the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies, into the snow-covered hills of Belgium, cutting through the thin American lines like a knife through canvas. Reports flooded in, 106th Division nearly destroyed, 28th and 99th pushed back, Bastogne encircled. The High Command reeled from the scale of the German attack. They had believed the war was nearly over, that Hitler's army had been spent. But now, a storm of steel and armor had erupted from the dense forests of the Ardennes, and at its edge, one man's name would soon become synonymous with the counterstrike that turned the tide, General George S. Patton. Yet in these early hours of December 19, Patton's Third Army was facing south, not north. His tanks were fighting deep in the Saar region. To swing them toward Bastogne, to move an entire army 90 degrees in freezing weather, was an act that many considered impossible. Even the German generals, with all their confidence in their panzers, believed Patton's divisions were too far away, their tanks too slow, their logistics too frozen to react in time. They underestimated him. They always had. Voiceover: the Germans thought Patton's armor was chained to the mud of Lorraine. They thought his tanks couldn't move in winter. They didn't know the man commanding them lived for impossible orders. At a forward command tent in Luxembourg, Patton stood hunched over a map lit by a single bulb, his gloved finger tracing the German advance with surgical precision. "They've hit us hard at Bastogne," an aide said. Patton grunted. "We'll hit them harder." He turned to his staff, voice sharp. "Get me Middleton. Tell him to hold Bastogne, I'm coming." The staff exchanged glances. To move north meant crossing miles of frozen countryside, through narrow roads clogged with retreating traffic and civilian refugees. But Patton didn't hesitate. "We'll pivot the entire Third Army. Every tank, every gun, every man. I want movement in 6 hours." Across the front, engines roared to life. In the 4th Armored Division, Lieutenant Jack Sheridan, a tanker from Kansas, climbed onto his M4 Sherman, the tank's surface crusted with frost. The men were exhausted, their machines battered from weeks of fighting in Lorraine. But orders were orders. Sheridan's driver, Private Vince D'Amico, kicked the starter. The engine coughed, spat, then came alive with a throaty growl. "We're going north?" D'Amico asked. Sheridan nodded. "Bastogne. They're surrounded." The driver frowned. "Hell of a time for a rescue mission." Sheridan didn't answer. In the distance, snow drifted through the pines like ghosts. Somewhere up there, men of the 101st Airborne were holding Bastogne, surrounded, outgunned, freezing, waiting for relief. As dawn broke, columns of Shermans, half-tracks, and trucks began to snake through the narrow, icy roads of Luxembourg, the barrels of their 75mm guns gleaming faintly in the pale light. The air was so cold that breath turned instantly to ice. Mechanics fought to keep the engines from seizing. Supply trucks followed with fuel drums lashed to their sides. The convoys stretched for miles. In the sky, Allied air support was grounded, fog and snow kept the P-47 Thunderbolts tied to the runways. Patton's men would have to move under the cover of clouds and hope the Luftwaffe stayed grounded too. At headquarters, Eisenhower could hardly believe the speed of Patton's response. "How long before you can attack?" he asked. 2 days, Patton said flatly. "We'll be in Bastogne by the 22nd. "That's impossible," someone muttered. Patton's eyes flashed. "That's why we'll do it." German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding the Ardennes offensive, was confident. His panzers had rolled deep into the American lines, their spearheads driving toward the Meuse River. He believed the U.S. Third Army was still bogged down far to the south. His staff maps showed no threat from Patton's direction. Intelligence officers assured him the Americans were too slow to react. But as night fell on December 19, they were already wrong. Somewhere outside Edelbruck, the rumble of Patton's tanks echoed through the hills, a sound that would soon reach the ears of the German generals like distant thunder. Among the columns, Sergeant Paul Kowalski sat in the back of a half-track, clutching a letter from his brother, a paratrooper with the 101st in Bastogne. The letter was dated a week earlier, snow's coming down hard. They say the Krauts are moving. Tell Ma I'll be home for Christmas. Now, as the half-track lurched through the icy ruts, Paul's stomach twisted. The last radio report had said Bastogne was surrounded. He couldn't get through to his brother. His commander had forbidden personal radio transmissions, but that night, as they bivouacked near Arlon, Kowalski slipped from his tent and broke protocol. He tuned his field radio to a shortwave frequency, trying desperately to catch any transmission from the 101st. All he got was static, and then, faintly, a voice, "This is Bastogne," still holding, out of ammo. The signal faded. Paul froze, the receiver trembling in his hand. Breaking radio silence was a court-martial offense, but he didn't care. He keyed the mic, "This is Third Army, Arlon Sector, hold on, boys. We're coming." There was no reply. Only static. But it was enough. The next morning, his unit was the first to roll out. The roads were sheets of ice. Tanks slid, trucks overturned, but the column kept moving. They crossed into Belgium under a gray sky. The trees loomed black and skeletal. Along the roadside lay the wrecks of previous battles, burned-out Shermans, twisted German half-tracks, their iron carcasses half buried in snow. The smell of oil and frozen mud filled the air. Every man in Patton's army knew what was at stake. If Bastogne fell, the Germans would have a straight path to the Meuse, and from there, perhaps to Antwerp. The entire Allied front could collapse. Patton's tanks pushed on, often covering 30 miles a day over terrain the Germans had thought impassable in winter. His engineers built makeshift bridges across frozen rivers. Fuel trucks moved in convoys under blackout conditions, dodging Luftwaffe strafing runs when the clouds briefly lifted. In the towns they passed, civilians peeked from doorways, stunned to see American armor moving north so fast. German reconnaissance planes reported massive enemy armor movement, the first clue Rundstedt had that something was wrong. By December 21, the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division had reached the outskirts of Martelange. There, they met stiff resistance from German panzergrenadiers of the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division, supported by 88 mm guns dug into the hills. The battle raged for hours. Snow mixed with smoke. A single German Tiger appeared on the ridge, its gun flashing. One shot tore through a Sherman, sending fire pouring from the hatches. Lieutenant Sheridan watched his friend's tank explode, then shouted to his gunner, "He, 200 meters, ridge line." The Sherman's 75 mm barked. The first shell missed. The second hit the Tiger's track, blowing it apart. The German crew bailed out, their silhouettes vanishing into the trees. Sheridan exhaled. "Keep moving," he ordered. Behind him, Patton's column pressed on. Every mile gained brought them closer to Bastogne. At headquarters that night, Patton knelt briefly by his cot, muttering his now famous prayer, "Lord, this is Patton talking. You know how important it is that we win this war. So I need you to make it stop raining. Grant us weather for battle." The next morning, the skies cleared. The sun rose over a white Ardennes. The air forces roared into life, C-47s dropping supplies over Bastogne, P-47 strafing German convoys. The timing was almost divine. On December 22, Patton's vanguard broke through the final German roadblocks south of Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, spearheaded the assault. They fought through Neufchâteau and Sabret, blasting through ambushes, artillery barrages, and minefields. By the evening of December 26, Abrams' lead tanks crested the hill at Assenois, and saw the outskirts of Bastogne below. The town was still smoking from days of shelling. Sheridan's Sherman rolled forward cautiously, its engine rumbling. Over the radio came the voice of a paratrooper, "This is the 101st. Who the hell are you?" Sheridan grinned through the frost. "Third Army, buddy. Merry Christmas." Cheers erupted over the radio. The siege was broken. Bastogne was relieved. In Berlin, Hitler raged. Rundstedt's staff realized too late that their assumption about Patton's slow tanks had been their fatal mistake. The very thing they thought impossible, a 90-degree turn in 3 days through winter terrain, had become Patton's masterpiece. Voiceover: In the coldest winter of the war, the German generals learned that speed wasn't measured in horsepower, it was measured in will. Sheridan climbed down from his tank, boots crunching in the snow. Around him, the paratroopers of the 101st emerged from the ruins, gaunt, unshaven, but smiling. He looked up at the gray sky, flakes falling again. Somewhere in the chaos, Sergeant Kowalski searched the faces until he found his brother, alive, wounded, but grinning. They embraced silently. Above them, the rumble of engines rolled through the Ardennes again, Patton's armor still advancing, still driving east. The war would continue, but this victory, born from frozen roads, impossible orders, and unyielding resolve, would forever silence those who called his tanks slow. Snow still fell over the ruins of Bastogne as Patton's tanks idled at the town's edge, their engines growling softly like beasts waiting for release, the faint smell of diesel and cordite hanging in the frigid air. The men had fought through 5 days of near-constant combat, and though the relief was real, Patton's orders were already shifting. There would be no pause, no victory parade, only the next objective. Bastogne was saved, but the Bulge still jutted deep into the Allied lines, and the German spearheads were fighting bitterly to hold their ground along the western edge near Houffalize and Saint-Vith. Voiceover: Victory in the Ardennes wasn't a single battle, it was a race to cut off the German salient before it could slip back through the woods. By dawn on December 27, the 4th Armored Division began pushing northeast of Bastogne, engaging elements of the German 5th Panzer Army in skirmishes that raged through small, frozen villages whose names few Americans could pronounce. The men were exhausted, their rations frozen solid, but they pressed on. Lieutenant Sheridan's Sherman had taken 2 hits from Panzerfausts during the Bastogne approach, its hull was scarred, paint stripped, but it still ran, held together by luck and the steady hands of its crew. Sheridan stood in the turret, scanning the snow-draped ridges through binoculars. "They're pulling back," he muttered. His radio crackled, "Eagle 6 to all armor units, enemy retreat confirmed north of Marvy. Push hard." Patton's command tent was already alive with movement. Intelligence reports showed the Germans withdrawing toward the Our River, burning villages and bridges to slow pursuit. Patton's finger stabbed the map again and again. "Cut them off before they reach the river. I want the Bulge flattened." To his staff, it was another impossible order. The roads were impassable, the tanks half-frozen, but Patton refused to let up. The speed that had stunned the Germans once would now destroy their retreat. Meanwhile, in a bunker near Ziegenberg, Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, slammed his fist on the table. "Patton's division should not be here," he barked. His intelligence officer muttered, "They moved faster than our scouts reported." Model glared at the map, the red arrows of Patton's Third Army were already pressing north of Bastogne. Hitler's grand gamble, the Ardennes offensive, was collapsing from its southern flank. Rundstedt argued for withdrawal, but Hitler, still in his wolf's lair in East Prussia, refused. "Hold every inch," he ordered. But every inch was being ground away beneath American treads. Back at the front, Sheridan's company reached the outskirts of Le Trebois. The village was a wreck, smoke rising from shattered houses, the bodies of both German and American soldiers frozen where they had fallen. Sheridan climbed down from his tank to inspect the ground, his boots crunched over shattered glass and shell casings. The silence was unnerving. Suddenly, from the tree lean, a burst of MG-42 fire erupted. Bullets sparked off the Sherman's glassy plate. "Contact left," shouted the gunner. Sheridan dove behind the tank, yelling into his radio, "All units, suppress that tree lean." The Shermans roared, their guns thundered, and the trees disintegrated under high-explosive shells. The skirmish lasted only minutes, but it was a reminder, even retreating, the Wehrmacht fought with precision and fury. When the smoke cleared, they found a dozen dead Germans, and one wounded teenager, maybe 16. Sheridan stared at him, the boy's face pale beneath a steel helmet far too big for him. "He's just a kid," muttered D'Amico. Sheridan said nothing. He turned away, jaw tight. Voiceover: the German army that Patton faced in the Ardennes was a mixture of hardened veterans and desperate boys. Every mile the Americans gained was paid for twice, once in fuel, and once in blood. By January 2, 1945, Patton's Third Army had fully linked with the First Army near Houffalize, effectively sealing off the southern pocket of the Bulge. The German divisions trapped inside fought savagely to escape, their panthers and tigers clawing through snow and mud. Patton's artillery unleashed unrelenting fire, over 50,000 shells in 3 days. The frozen ground shook. Air support returned in force, waves of P-47 swept over the battlefield, their machine guns raking the retreating columns. Smoke pillars rose against the white horizon. Patton watched from his forward command jeep, binoculars steady. "They thought we were slow," he said quietly to his aide, "but slow men don't chase the Wehrmacht through hell." The aide didn't reply. He didn't have to. The evidence was all around them, miles of wrecked panzers, burnt trucks, and shattered guns marking the route of the German retreat. In Berlin, Hitler's rage grew uncontrollable. Rundstedt's reports described Patton's mobility as unprecedented. Goebbels tried to frame the retreat as a tactical withdrawal, but even the propaganda ministry couldn't hide the disaster. Hitler screamed that Rundstedt and Model had failed him, but in truth, it was Patton's relentless drive that had broken their offensive. In the field, Sheridan's battalion was ordered to pivot east toward the Aar the River. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Frostbite cases soared. Mechanics had to light fires under tank engines just to keep the oil from freezing. Fuel shortages became critical, each Sherman had to be rationed to a few gallons a day. Yet somehow, they kept moving. They captured villages that existed on no map, fought ambushes in forests so dense the sun never reached the ground. At night, the men huddled under blankets stiff with ice, listening to the distant boom of artillery. One night, Sheridan found Sergeant Kowalski sitting alone beside a frozen stream, staring at a photograph of his brother. "You found him," Sheridan said softly. Kowalski nodded. "Yeah. He made it out. Bastogne. Lucky bastard." He laughed once, bitterly. "Whole damn army out here, and it comes down to luck." Sheridan didn't disagree. The war had long since stopped feeling heroic. It was mechanical, grinding, endless. The next morning, they attacked again. German resistance grew fiercer as they neared the town of Wiltz. The 5th Panzer Army had regrouped there, forming a temporary defensive line. The battle lasted 3 days. Tanks clashed at point-blank range in narrow streets. Artillery reduced whole blocks to rubble. Sheridan's company lost 5 tanks in a single afternoon. But by January 10, the town was theirs. The German retreat had become a rout. Voiceover: by mid-January, Patton's Third Army had closed the southern jaw of the Bulge. The German dream of splitting the Allied front was over. What began as Hitler's last great gamble ended as a frozen graveyard of tanks. Yet Patton wasn't finished. He ordered the pursuit to continue, to press the advantage, to drive the enemy back across the Siegfried Line. His staff protested that the men were exhausted, the equipment near collapse. Patton's reply was simple: "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." And so they moved again. The 6th Armored Division advanced toward the Sauer River, engaging German rearguards in desperate night battles. Mortars thumped. Tracers arced through the darkness. Sheridan's unit crossed the river under fire, the water black and icy, their pontoon bridges creaking under the weight of the Shermans. On the far bank, they captured a ridge overlooking Vianden. From there, they could see Germany itself, the dark hills of the Eifel just beyond. The men stared in silence. After months of fighting, they were finally at the doorstep of the Reich. Back at 3rd Army headquarters, Patton received a message from Eisenhower: "Outstanding work. The enemy's offensive is broken." Patton nodded, then turned to his aide. "Tell the men they did well. Then tell them we attack again tomorrow." His staff exchanged weary smiles. That was Patton, relentless, merciless, always moving. In the snow-choked villages they liberated, Belgian civilians waved from doorways, offering bottles of frozen wine and loaves of bread. The soldiers smiled, but their eyes were hollow. They had seen too much. Sheridan sat on the hull of his tank one evening, watching the sun sink behind the ridges. The snow glittered gold in the fading light. "You think they'll remember this?" D'Amico asked quietly. Sheridan shrugged. "Maybe. But they'll never know what it smelled like, diesel and death." Voiceover: The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a final victory parade, but with silence. The forests of the Ardennes swallowed the echoes of engines and left only graves behind. On January 25, 1945, the last German units withdrew across the Aar River. The Bulge was gone. Patton's tanks had erased it, mile by mile, proving that speed was not a function of machines, but of men, and of one man's will to drive harder than anyone thought possible. Yet Patton did not rest. Even as his army regrouped, his orders were already forming for the next push, across the Moselle, through the Siegfried Line, into Germany. The snow began to fall again, soft and endless. Sheridan stood beside his tank, looking east. The Ardennes lay behind him, scarred, frozen, and silent. He thought of the men who hadn't made it, the burned-out tanks still smoking in the woods, the letters that would never reach home. He climbed back into the Sherman, engine rumbling to life once more. Somewhere in the distance, Patton's voice echoed over the radio: "Keep going. Don't stop until you reach the Rhine." And they did. The snow began to thaw by early February 1945, leaving the Ardennes a graveyard of rusting tanks and shattered forests, the frozen silence replaced by the grinding of tracks moving east. Patton's Third Army, bloodied but unbroken, turned its eyes toward Germany. The Ardennes campaign had ended in victory, but for Patton, it was never enough. He wanted to end the war completely, to drive straight into the Reich before spring. The roads were rivers of mud now, the thaw turning every field into a quagmire, but the columns moved anyway. Engineers laid steel mats across the mire to let the Shermans pass, trucks laden with fuel and ammunition slipping dangerously close to ditches swollen with melted snow. Voiceover: Patton's tanks had proven they could move in snow and ice. Now they would prove they could move through mud and ruin. On February 1, the Third Army crossed into the German borderlands near the Prum River. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, rose ahead of them, a wall of dragon's teeth, pillboxes, and bunkers stretching across the hills. Patton's scouts reported that the Germans had reoccupied the line with remnants of divisions shattered in the Bulge. Rundstedt, desperate to stall the Allies, had ordered the old defenses manned by any available troops: Volkssturm, clerks, teenagers, and old men armed with Panzerfausts. Sheridan's unit, now reinforced and refitted, was assigned to spearhead the assault near Bitburg. The men had barely rested since Bastogne. Sheridan climbed into his new Sherman EZ-8, faster, better armed, its 76mm gun a match for most German armor, and gave the signal. Artillery thundered, shaking the ground. The Siegfried bunkers answered with 88mm shells that screamed overhead. Tanks advanced through smoke and mud. The first line of Dragon's Teeth was breached by engineers with satchel charges. Sheridan's platoon roared forward, trading shots with hidden guns. One shell tore through a neighboring Sherman, killing the crew instantly. Sheridan didn't flinch. "Keep moving," he yelled. "Don't stop for anything." They reached the first ridge, guns blazing, clearing bunkers with grenades. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Siegfried Line was broken in Patton's sector, one of the first breaches of the German homeland. Voiceover: for the German army, the myth of invincibility ended at the Siegfried Line. For Patton, it was just another line on a map to erase. In Berlin, Hitler's fury was volcanic. Rundstedt again requested permission to retreat deeper into Germany to consolidate, but Hitler refused. "Fight where you stand," he ordered. But his words were hollow. The Wehrmacht was collapsing, strangled by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority. In March 1945, Patton's Third Army reached the Moselle River near Trier. Eisenhower's broad front strategy called for steady advances by all armies, but Patton moved faster than anyone. He wanted to reach the Rhine before Montgomery to the north could claim the glory. On March 1, he captured Trier, Germany's oldest city, against orders to bypass it. When Eisenhower's headquarters radioed to ask why he had disobeyed, Patton replied, "I took it with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back?" The message became legend. Sheridan's battalion entered Trier that same day. The city was in ruins, bridges blown, streets littered with debris. The local civilians watched silently as the Shermans rolled through. On the steps of the ancient Porta Nigra, Sheridan paused to look out over the Moselle Valley. "We're in Germany," he murmured. It didn't feel like victory, just exhaustion. The next objective was clear: the Rhine River. The Germans had long considered it their natural barrier, a symbol of their nation's heart. Crossing it meant breaking the last defense between the Allies and the core of the Reich. Patton intended to cross it before anyone else. Voiceover: to Patton, rivers weren't obstacles, they were invitations. On March 22, 1945, near Oppenheim, Patton stood on a bluff overlooking the Rhine. The river shimmered under the moonlight, broad and silent. He ordered an immediate crossing, no waiting for pontoon bridges, no waiting for Montgomery's carefully planned assault to the north. "Get across," he told his engineers. Now. At 2,200 hours, under the cover of darkness, the first elements of the 5th Infantry Division paddled across in small boats, the icy water biting at their faces. German artillery opened fire, shells exploding in the water, but the Americans kept going. By dawn, they had a bridgehead on the eastern bank. Within hours, Sherman tanks followed on hastily constructed pontoon bridges. The crossing was complete, before Montgomery had even launched his operation. When Eisenhower heard the news, he asked, "How did Patton do it?" His aide replied, "He just went." Voiceover: Patton's tanks had raced through the Ardennes in winter, and now, in spring, they raced through the heart of Germany. Sheridan's tank crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim 2 days later. The sun was rising, the river glowing gold in the light. "Never thought I'd see this side," D'Amico said, staring at the opposite shore. Sheridan nodded slowly. Neither did they. Beyond the Rhine, resistance crumbled. The German army was shattered. Villages surrendered without a fight, others were defended fanatically by SS units unwilling to yield. Patton's divisions advanced at lightning speed, covering over 50 miles a day. In the skies, P-51 Mustangs hunted columns of retreating trucks. The roads were choked with refugees and prisoners. Patton ordered his forces to bypass strongpoints and strike deep, to keep the momentum that had defined him since Africa. On March 25, Third Army liberated hundreds of Allied POWs near Hammelburg. The raid, though chaotic and controversial, showed Patton's personal drive to save his men, even against orders. Voiceover: Patton's war was fought not just with maps and orders, but with instinct, sometimes reckless, always relentless. As March drew to an end, the Rhine was behind them, and Germany lay open. The war's end was now a question of time. Sheridan's crew rolled through towns that looked untouched by battle, half empty, silent, as if the war had already passed them by. In one, a white flag hung from every window. The crew didn't stop. They'd seen too much to celebrate. On April 1st, Patton's forces linked with the U.S. 9th Army near Kassel, encircling the entire Ruhr industrial region, the heart of Nazi Germany's war production. Over 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. Patton stood by his command car, watching the columns of prisoners march west. "So this is the end," he said quietly. But it wasn't quite over. His tanks kept pushing east, reaching the banks of the Elbe River by mid-April. Beyond that lay the Red Army. The Americans were ordered to halt, but Patton looked longingly across the water toward the Soviet lines. "We could have gone to Berlin," he muttered. "And they know it." His men, worn and weary, finally rested. The engines of their Shermans fell silent. The same tanks that had clawed through the frozen Ardennes were now parked in green German fields, their paint scarred, their barrels blackened. Sheridan walked among them, touching the cold steel. He thought of December, the snow, the fear, the endless road north to Bastogne. It seemed like years ago. Sergeant Kowalski stood beside him, a cigarette in hand. "You believe it's over?" he asked. Sheridan looked east, where the sky glowed faintly with the fires of the collapsing Reich. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "But I don't think it'll ever really end." Voiceover: For the men who fought in the Ardennes, victory was not a moment, it was a memory that never stopped echoing. In the months that followed, Patton's Third Army occupied southern Germany. His troops liberated concentration camps, saw horrors they could not describe, and realized that their war had been for more than land or pride. Patton himself stood on a balcony overlooking the Rhine one last time that summer, hands clasped behind his back. "The river looks peaceful now," he said to his aide. "But it cost a hell of a lot to make it that way." His tanks had raced from the snows of Belgium to the heart of Germany in just 3 months, a feat of speed and audacity unmatched in modern warfare. The German generals who had once mocked him for being too slow were now prisoners of his army. Rundstedt would later say, "Patton's movement through the Ardennes was the greatest example of operational maneuver I ever witnessed." The camera lingers on the river, sunlight glinting off its surface. The voiceover fades in one last time. From the frozen woods of Bastogne to the shining waters of the Rhine, Patton's tanks never slowed. They carried not just steel and men, but the weight of a world desperate to be free. The wind rises, carrying with it the distant sound of engines, fading now, like ghosts rolling home through time. The frame narrows to a single tank track imprinted in the mud, leading east, a symbol of a drive that never stopped. Then, silence.